Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 358. This week the questions are taken from Guide 427 on the Bolzano, a unique heavy cruiser of the Italian Navy, the Wednesday video on HMS X1, the cruiser sub, and the Friday video on the apparently Småland. BK Zhong asks, which class of Regia Marina warship made the greatest contribution to the overall Axis war effort? Possibly slightly controversial pick, and I remain anticipatory of various Italian viewers' comments, but I would personally pick the Speaker-class torpedo boats. You can see, I think this is Signo here. The reason I pick them is because they were pretty much everywhere and doing pretty much everything during the Mediterranean part of the Second World War. They were sub-hunting to actually a fair degree of success. They were doing convoy escort and convoy raiding. Now, to be fair, that often didn't come off particularly well against large British destroyers, but they did try and give as good as they got, and they did manage to damage and or sink a number of British destroyers and a couple of cruisers, I think, damaged as well, which, given that they're sub-1,000-ton ships, is a pretty good showing. They also obviously heavily engaged by British aircraft. They did fast convoy runs of their own rather than convoy escort, where they were transporting supplies and troops and so forth. And of course they were doing general fleet escort duties and such like. So they were doing pretty much everything. Yes, the class did suffer some fairly significant losses, but I think on a per ton basis they caused quite a bit of damage to the Allied war effort, probably well in excess of the amount invested in them by the Regia Marina. So, yeah, I think they've got a fairly good shot at the prize. Burnett asks, was the Italian attempt at an aircraft carrier a good design, and if it had been finished earlier in the war, could it have made any difference in the Mediterranean? Well, it depends which one you mean, because of course the Italians had Aquila, Spaviero, and a few other lesser-known attempts. But if we're going to assume you mean Aquila, because that's, to be honest, the best-known one and the one that came closest to completion, bearing in mind, of course, that she is a conversion, and therefore she cannot be as good as a purpose-built carrier of the same tonnage, yeah, I think overall Aquila is a pretty decent attempt at a carrier, especially for a first-time attempt at a carrier. Now, the closest comparison that would be fair is the Heave class, because you could theoretically compare them to the Illustrious class, but the Illustrious class, while having roughly the same tonnage, are of course dedicated purpose-built carriers, which would make the comparison unfair. So if you look at the Heaves, which are, within a few hundred tons of Aquila, what do we have? Well, the Heaves can do just over 25 knots. Aquila was planned to do 30, so speed better than the Heaves and also nicely in the realm of what's useful for carrier operations. Range, now, to be fair, the Heaves have them fairly well beat at that point, but at the same time, Aquila's only needs to operate in the Mediterranean. The range that she has is fairly adequate for that. Armament, well, here Aquila has a really big advantage. Now, both parties are bringing some sort of 5-inch-ish caliber weapons to the party. Probably the less said about either of them, the better. But in terms of actually useful anti-aircraft armament, the planned armament for Aquila is vast, over 130 20mm cannons plus some mid-sized 65mm. The Japanese have the misfortune of dealing with much smaller numbers, but ever-increasing numbers of the Japanese 25mm, and the less said about that, the better. And the Italians managed to incorporate some armour to protect the vitals of the ship, of considerable more thickness and considerably more usefulness than the relatively minimal protection found on Heave, and they didn't really lose out on air group. Both carriers planned to have, and in the Heave's case, actually having an air group of just over 50, albeit if Aquila had got folding wing aircraft, that could have gone up even more. So, broadly speaking, Aquila is faster, has a similar air group in terms of overall numbers, is better protected both in guns and armour. The only thing she's really short of compared to Hio is range, and as we said, well, operating in the Mediterranean, not so much of a problem. The interesting thing, one thing I actually really like about Aquila is that the air group was supposed to be, after, to be fair, a fairly extensive set of trials, RE 2001s, and that's it. So they're fighters, but it turns out they're fighters that can be equipped with bombs or torpedoes. I mean, okay, you have to make some slight adjustments to the RE 2001 to get a torpedo under there, but fundamentally, it remains a fighter that's capable of carrying a torpedo, which means it's going to get to the target faster, and once it's released its torpedo, it's much, much better able to defend itself than a conventional torpedo bomber. Now, you can make an argument that perhaps the RE 2001 doesn't have a world-ending level of armament, nor indeed a particularly world-ending level of performance, but a single homogeneous type being your air group is a pretty nifty thing, I think. And theoretically, the performance of it could have led to potentially very large torpedo strike groups with a relatively minimal dedicated fighter escort, because as I said, all that escort has to do is get the strike to the target. Once they've dropped the torpedoes, everybody's a fighter. Now, as for the question of whether it could have made a difference if it was finished earlier in the war, that's a little bit of a sliding scale, because if Aquila was finished substantially earlier in the war, and it would have to be substantial, they would have had to start the conversion a couple of years ahead of time to get her in when it could have made any difference significantly, really. She is therefore going to have a less capable air group. She's going to have a previous generation of aircraft, which therefore may mean that she is a less capable carrier, generally speaking, compared to one that's equipped exclusively with RE 2001s. But if she is available, let's say 6 months to a year into the Mediterranean conflict, she could have had quite an effect in the Mediterranean, both defensively and offensively, because of course defensively, things like the Battle of Cape Matapan, where the majority of the Zara class is destroyed and Vittorio Veneto sent into the dockyard for a while, that, if Aquila had been around, could have been a very different story, because ultimately when the various attack aircraft, primarily obviously Swordfish, show up, the Italian fleet doesn't have anything they can do about that other than bunch up and hope their anti-aircraft fire works, which, spoiler alert, it doesn't. Whereas if they'd had Aquila with them, then there could have been at least a dozen or so fighters on combat air patrol, and it's very likely that that attack may not have gone in. Now, of course, the flip side to that is the Royal Navy may have completely changed how they launched that attack if they knew there was an Italian carrier out there, but you're at least forcing the Royal Navy to react. And then you have all sorts of clashes between the Royal Navy and the Regia Marina, the Battle of Calabria, Battle of Cape Spartivento, First and Second Sirte, etc. Any one of those, if one side has a carrier capable of fighter reconnaissance and torpedo strike and the other doesn't, again, it could make all the difference. So, yeah, an early Aquila, despite at that point probably having a much less capable anti-aircraft battery and air group, could in theory have made a very significant difference to the Mediterranean campaign, or alternatively, even if that alternative is forcing the British to deploy more carriers, that's still a fairly major change, because that means carriers have to be drawn from elsewhere, which means those areas are less effective from a British war perspective. And also, of course, depends how long she lasts. If you wanted to be really cruel, she could get mined or torpedoed on her first voyage, and that's it. But such are the vagaries of war. Josh Thomas Moore asks, in the Hornblower TV series, various carriers say the line 2-6 Heave. Was this an actual command in the Royal Navy at the time, and if so, why did they use 2 and 6? Some variant of that probably was in use by the Royal Navy at the time. It probably wasn't 2-6 Heave. There's a lot of sort of legendarium stuff going around about it. And the thing is, its use has changed as time goes on. So the command was still in use in the Royal Navy within living memory. But if you go back through Admiralty manuals of seamanship, once you get into kind of the mid-20th century and earlier, you actually see, although it's listed as 126 heave. 26 heave appears to be essentially a mid to late 20th century shortening of it. And also, interestingly, the Admiralty manuals of seamanship list it as a command for hauling ropes, whereas it's often said to be to haul it out a gun, but the Admiralty seems to consider it a general rope pulling call. And thus various proposals have been put forward for where it comes from. Some say it's a corruption of French, tout de suite heave, which, or whatever the French for heave is, which would be immediately heave, like quickly, but that doesn't account for where the one comes from, although theoretically, as with many things that were adapted from the French, it could have initially come over as someone going, oh, 2-6, and then someone going, well, why 2-6? 2 is not the first number, so we'll do 1-2-6. That's a possibility. My personal interpretation, given that it does seem to at least originate from a period when you would have to be hauling ropes under fire, whether that be the 19th or 18th century, that's up to etymology scholars to debate. But my theory is that whatever the original origins of it are, I think the settling on 6 and then heave probably has to do with what makes for an audible command in the din of battle. Because 1 and 2 are fairly short numbers, very easy to enunciate, very easy to actually make yourself heard. You yell 1, 2. The problem is 3 is a longer form word, and it's slightly weaker. I mean, you can yell 3, but if you yell 1 or 2, it's still fairly definitive. If you try and yell or scream 3, you lose the definition of the thr part fairly quickly, and it can sound like you're just screaming, Fee! Which is a little bit unintelligible. And also, when you've got cannonballs whipping past you going, Whee! Could be lost in the din. 4, the F is a somewhat soft sound. And again, if you're screaming 4, you tend to lose the F a little bit, and just screaming, oh, that could just sound like you've been hit by a cannonball. 5, in the words of Monty Python, is right out, but mostly because if you yell 5, it could sound like you're yelling fire, which is not what you're trying to achieve at that point. Whereas 6, like 1 and 2, is a very short, punchy number, which can be shouted while retaining its definition and can't be easily mistaken for anything else in the circumstances. So if someone shouts 1, 2, 6, heave, you're going to hear it. It's just long enough for you to catch on to what's going on, and you know what's coming without the risk of confusion. That would be my personal interpretation. Martin C. Horowitz asks, what would typically be placed inside the bulbous bow of a ship? Would they be empty to help with buoyancy, serve as storage, or have some other purpose? Typically speaking, at least in the time period the channel covers, a bulbous bow is going to be mostly empty to just give that little bit of extra buoyancy, and also to not impose a significant weight on the ship's extreme end, but it's also got to be relatively strongly braced with a relatively thick amount of hull plating, because of course this is the very front leading edge of the ship. It's going to be subject to a lot of slamming, a lot of pushing, a lot of general force, so you can't make it out of very thin plates because it's just going to get dished in and damaged quite quickly. And given that it is resisting the water considerably more than just the conventional bow is, and you can see this is a view from right down at the bottom of USS New Jersey, so you can immediately understand how there would be a little bit more water resistance to the bulbous bow than there would be further up the bow where it's nice and knife-edged. So you do have to have a fair bit of cross-bracing in there just to stop it crushing in and dishing in anyway. But really that's about it, because you're talking about something that's really, really far down in the ship. There's no practical use for storage that far down and that far forward, or really much of anything else, other than just having its effect in assisting the ship through the water. Martin Honor asks, Italian cruisers' main guns seem to be mounted very close to each other. Did this cause interference between the shells when fired together, or did guns in the turret fire alternately? Yes, the close spacing did cause a number of dispersion issues for the Italian guns. They tried to solve it by means of two methods. So, firstly, they reduced the charges because these were very high velocity guns, and obviously high velocity, bigger muzzle blast, more interference. So they thought, okay, we'll reduce the muzzle velocity slightly, that might help. It helped a little, but not much. And so they also then introduced a delay coil, so the guns fired very slightly separately to each other, which meant that, ideally speaking, the shockwave of one gun firing had passed through the airspace of the other gun before the shell of the second gun emerged, and therefore, ideally, was less interfered with. It reduced the problem. It didn't completely eliminate it, but it brought their accuracy levels down from really wide dispersion to reasonable dispersion. And they were pretty useful guns once that was established. I mean, they certainly hit a few Allied ships with them. Warrant Officer Will asks, in Drydock 323 and 324, you mentioned that both the X1 and M class of British submarines, if refitted, could have been very useful commerce raiders against the Japanese, especially in the early part of the Pacific War, where the US submarine fleet was stuck with inadequate surface firepower and the physical manifestation of failure known as the Mark 14. So my question would be, if the British had retrofitted the X1 and the M class for the Pacific campaign, could X1 and the M class, along with any other British subs that were historically in the area, have potentially sunk more tonnage for the US in 41 and or 42? And if not, how would their numbers have stacked up in comparison to US numbers? I don't think just 4 subs could have sunk more than the entire US war effort for submarines in 42. So I did take a look through Japanese shipping losses for the period, and roughly ballparking it, because I wasn't going to sit there and count every single entry, but, well, I'd started and then started sort of going, well, that's roughly 5, that's 3, 4, 5, etc. Anyway, it looks like US submarines managed to account for around 150 to maybe 160 ships all told, mostly cargo ships, a few warships, etc., and mostly by torpedo in the entirety of 1942. Now, you might think, oh, hang on a minute, that doesn't sound too bad. Bear in mind that in the same year, the Germans sank about 10 times as many ships. See, that's the difference of having working torpedoes. And, in 42, the Germans are going up against convoys that are fairly heavily escorted, and the Americans are going up against a navy that has very little in the way of effective anti-submarine warfare. So, yeah, there's a really big difference when you don't have particularly effective torpedoes. But with that said, 4 subs to get 160 ships, you'd essentially have to have the British version of Gunter Prien Otto Kretschmer on board every single one of them, because obviously that divides down to, if they wanted to equal the number of ships that US subs sank, you'd have to have, assuming none of the British subs are sunk by Japanese efforts during that time period or suffer any significant damage or time in dock, so they're able to pretty much consistently go out on patrol, each submarine needs to sink 40 ships during that year in order to equal the combined output of the US Navy subfleet. And that is quite literally matching Otto Kretschmer's output on a per-month basis. Which, let's face it, yeah, that's relatively unlikely. Now, if you had, certainly I think X1 would have been the most effective of those subs, because, yeah, the M class are big, and stripping out the 12-inch gun, sticking in a bunch more torpedoes, and working torpedoes, would have made them reasonably effective submarines in the Pacific waters, but they would have, theoretically, if you're going to deploy random British subs out there, you might have been better off putting the Thames class out there, for instance, or even the Grampus class, the mine layers, because they also have torpedo tubes as well. But those are basically the big British subs. So I think realistically, you probably could have expected each of those, again, assuming that they're not sunk at some point by Japanese efforts, to maybe claim, I would say a dozen, somewhere between a dozen and 20 over the course of the year would have been a reasonable assumption. So that would average out at, say, about 40 to 50 total kills between a retrofitted M-class. X1, I think, though, would do especially well. If she's been retrofitted and kept around, so in my ideal world, retrofitted with the supercharged near 5,000 horsepower diesels of the Thames class, then she's going to be absolutely booking it across the sea. She's going to be much, much faster. She's probably going to be the fastest submarine, period, out there on the surface. And as covered in the X1 video, she's actually surprisingly well handled underwater. She's got torpedoes. She's got the gun armament, especially against unprotected or poorly protected Japanese convoys. I can actually see X1 doing exceptionally well. And all it would take would be for her, especially in 42, when you've got a lot of Japanese troop convoys around, all it would take would be for her to get in amongst one or two of the troop convoys, and she could start racking up the kills really quickly. Now, of course, there is a certain amount of high risk, high reward going on here. And again, we are assuming that she survives the entirety of 42, although that's probably somewhat more reasonable given her significantly greater capabilities than all of the M's making it through. But I think she could maybe not match Kretschmer, but certainly get close to. I mean, bear in mind, obviously, Kretschmer's very good, but he's also very good against convoys that actually have defences. X1's captain doesn't necessarily have to be a British Kretschmer, but he could have almost as much, if not as much, success thanks to the poor nature of Japanese anti-submarine warfare. So then, let's be a little generous and say X1 manages to kill a couple of convoys wholesale with her guns, maybe picking off the one or two escorts that matter with torpedoes, then closing in, surfing and going, hey, free gunfire for everybody. You get a shell, you get a shell, everybody gets shells. Then let's say she gets 35-ish ships sunk. That would put the British on roughly 80 kills for the year, which would on paper make those 4 submarines, again, assuming they survive the entire year, half as effective as the entire US submarine force, which, again, kind of shows the difference when you have working torpedoes, and in the case of X1, a rather vicious gun battery. C. Babylon asks, after World War I, did the Japanese see any of these cruiser submarines, and do you think it influenced them when it came to designing their larger ones in World War II? The Japanese definitely knew about the K-class because they were still allies with the British when the K-class were in service. And, well, they knew about X1 to the degree that almost everybody else knew about X1, which was limited but somewhat. And yes, you could say to a certain extent the Japanese were influenced by them. I mean, for example, this is one of the earliest Japanese Kadai-type submarines. Look at that bow. Yeah, they took cues from the K-class initially. But you don't really have to wait until World War II for the Japanese to design large subs. The Japanese took the idea of large subs and they ran with it very early. I mean, they built a fleet that was technically centered around a large and small submarine mix, but their large submarines, even from the early 1920s going forwards, were as big or bigger than pretty much what everybody else considered to be a large submarine, and their small submarines were still somewhat larger than what most people would consider small to medium submarines. And that trend only grew greater as time went on. So, they're already building 17, 18, 1900 ton subs in the early 20s, and that's service displacement. By the time you get to World War II, of course, they're 2,500+ ton subs. Although, as the big submarines get really big, you do end up with a kind of a third tranche of very much smaller, submarines whose displacement on the surface is measured in hundreds of tons rather than thousands of tons, which they do also construct. But yes, very early on, the big subs that the British and a few others were building did influence Japanese thinking, but they really very quickly took it and made it their own. Nico J. Pap asks, this seems like a question which must have already been asked at some point, but with the apparent frequency with which submarines found themselves directly under pursuing vessels, would they have benefited from some form of upwardly aimed reverse depth charge or vertical torpedo that they could use in self-defense once submerged? And was this something like it ever in the works? As far as I can tell, nobody seems to have seriously considered the matter. And there are a few good reasons for that. Firstly, of course, you're talking about a much more varied target profile, because if you're firing a torpedo at a surface target conventionally, you're essentially firing it on a 2D plane. So your target and hopefully your torpedo are on the same level. You just have to calculate the interception point. Whereas if you're firing upwards, well, you've got to have the horizontal correct, but you've also got to have now a vertical element correct, because you could be right on the money for where the ship is on its route of progress, but you could be a little bit to the, well, for what your perspective is, up or down, from the enemy ship's perspective, port or starboard, and the torpedo pops up and doesn't do anything. So it's going to be harder to hit with a torpedo. Another problem with launching a torpedo is that your average submarine launched torpedo is 20 foot or more in length. The average submarine pressure hull is less than that. Even a big fleet boat like a Gato class only has about a 16 and a bit foot pressure hull diameter. So you are not storing a torpedo in a vertically launched tube that's going to fit in the pressure hull. If you're going to do it at all, you're going to have it fitted on the side, and if you're going to have it vertically launched, that's going to be very awkward indeed. And it's going to take up a lot of space and weight for something that you are relatively unlikely, hopefully, to need. Another problem, of course, is that both targets are moving, so you might be vaguely under your opponent, but not necessarily precisely underneath your opponent. That would be a very, very rare confluence. And ultimately, the problem with both depth charges and buoyant depth charge and a torpedo is that these distances aren't going to be all that great. You know, even if you're down at 300 feet, there's going to be, maybe 200, 250 foot of clearance between you and your target, because obviously your target's going to have draft, and if you're at 300 feet at keel, your conning tower is going to be somewhat higher than that. Do you really want to be in that kind of close distance when several hundred kilos of explosive go off? That's probably not going to do your sub any good, as much as it might not do the surface ship any good. You're going to suffer almost as much, thanks to the fact that you're already under pressure. And the problem with the buoyant depth charges, of course, that's going to take even longer to get to the surface, which point, it might miss, the ship might just move, all sorts of things. So, yeah, basically it's just better to head off in a direction that the ship that's chasing you isn't, and try and get close to the surface to launch a conventional torpedo, because that at least might not kill you. Gustav Eliasson firstly says that the A with a little tiny O over it in the Swedish destroyer should be pronounced like the OU in for, so or, which would make it Småland instead of Småland. Feel free, Swedish people, to tell me in the comments if I got it even close to correct. In any case, his question is, I've noticed a weird hoist arrangement for German large caliber naval turrets, and my initial assumption is that the guns and gun cradles are expected to shield the hoists from spalling in case a heavy shell impacts on the walls of the gunhouse. Nonetheless, there's now a bunch of unused floor space outboard of the guns, so if the hoists were instead moved out as far outboard as possible while clearing the big bearing underneath, wouldn't that leave a bunch of free space between the guns? And while this might leave the hoists a little bit more vulnerable, this arrangement would seem to require less lateral space, thus allowing for narrowing of the whole gunhouse, and potentially also the barbette itself. But by how much, if at all? In theory, it's a good idea, but it does run into two rather significant problems. Firstly, of course, the further out across the turret the hoists are, that means that, well, the hoists have to go vertically downwards. So instead of having a vaguely central column where you can feed ammunition up to the turret, it's going to be being on the outer edges of the barbette. Then down in the magazines, it's going to be further out, which means as the turret rotates, the bit where you have to feed the shells and the cartridges is going to be spinning around the floor space. You're going to have to be chasing it and trying to avoid being crushed if the turrets are moving while you're trying to, load the thing, which would be fun. The other big problem in doing so is you can kind of see the full extent of the system here, and it would back onto and override the ejection system for the brass cartridges because Krupp sliding breech blocks, and that's what these the two sort of almost torpedo tube type things, top and bottom on the far right of this picture, are. Now, you could, in theory, I suppose, argue that if you move the hoist outboard, you could move the ejection systems inboard, but at that point, I don't think you'd be saving much space, if at all. And as well as the aforementioned issues with having to have your magazine crew chase the projectile and cartridge hoists all around the magazine floor, you'd also have the problem of you've now got these two brass cartridge case ejector systems sitting slap bang in the middle of the turret. And that would be something of an obstacle for the gun crews to negotiate, I suspect, because they have to go, from the gun all the way to the back of the turret. Now, the shell storage for ready-use ammunition, which you can see kind of center right, that's not a brilliant obstacle to traverse, but you can see there is some space around the back if you have to get from one side of the turret to the other. Whereas, and to a certain degree, even in front of it, assuming that you're not loading at that point. But with the cartridge ejection systems, you're not going to have that. Josh Thomas Moore asks, could you talk about the Tonsil anti-aircraft system the Royal Navy made to shoot down German flying bombs? Well, here it is, and if there is a more British weapon system, I have yet to find it. Yeah, this is literally a 1940s British lorry with a pair of Z battery UP3 rocket launchers strapped on the back. Oh, it is delightful. So apparently, well, you can see there's kind of the aiming device there with the little doors open in the middle. Apparently, according to the very minimal amount of information that's available, is that this is essentially a portable Z battery, so anti-aircraft rockets. It's credited setting up on the Kent coast between Hythe and Dymchurch, incidentally, the site of the Romney Hythe and Dymchurch Light Railway, which is an excellent place to visit if you're into small functional steam railways that can still haul people around, but nonetheless, the idea of this was to rapidly be able to reposition a bunch of rockets to take out German flying bombs, V1s. It's credited with what on the surface seems to be a frankly unlikely number of kills, getting its first kill very quickly and then taking down multiple other V1s in a fairly short space of time, which, if you consider the abysmal success of the UP rocket launchers on British capital ships and the, let's be fair, general ineffectiveness of the Z batteries as a whole, you might immediately go, F to doubt, how could this possibly be effective? However, when you look at how these batteries were set up, specifically the rockets, I can potentially see how this might actually have been fairly effective. Because the Z battery rockets came in multiple different flavors. You had the Admiralty type flavor, which you saw on the really big UP rockets on warships, which fired little mines with cables attached to them. The idea being an aircraft would snag the cable and haul the mine onto itself and detonate. You had attempts at proximity fuses, spoiler alert, not particularly successful. And you also had a variant that was kind of similar to the parachute mine, but this just fired a really long cable up into the air, somewhat similar to basically an instant deploy barrage balloon cable. And it's that variant that I think might be the Tonsil system's sort of ace in the hole, specifically against V1s. Because one of the reasons that the system as a whole wasn't massively effective against German aircraft was, well, if you fire a bunch of rockets at an aircraft and they're all trailing a bunch of cables, then in the 3D space that's available to them, a German pilot's going, I don't want to fly into cables, I'm going to go around them. I'm going to move my aircraft somewhat to the left or the right and avoid them. So, okay, fair enough. Spoiler alert, V1s don't have that capability. V1s just go nice and plodding along in a straight line. So I think, given that you're talking about multiple batteries of these, so you're not talking about just, here's this vehicle, this is going to engage V1s, you're talking about a couple of dozen, almost, of these things. What I think they're doing, by positioning themselves up on the Kent Cliffs, is that between radar and visual warning, you can see a V1 coming, quite literally, from a fair old distance away. And you just sit there and go, okay, that's really nice. Chug, 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 chug. Nice straight line. Take careful aim. You can essentially then do a bit of deflection, so you're shooting and go, okay, he's there. He's going at this angle. And to be fair, V1s didn't go particularly high either. So he's going to pass through this airspace in a dead straight line. And then what you do is, well, you know how long, you've got time to estimate the altitude of the thing, you know how long it's going to take your rockets to get there, and the cables are going to be somewhat persistent. I mean, they're going to come down eventually, but not immediately. So then you go, okay, let's say, for sake of argument, it's going to take 5 seconds for our rockets to get to the altitude of the V1. So we've predicted where the V1 is going to be. And because we're up on the cliffs, we've probably had multiple chances to check and recheck our calculations. And that's what the guy aiming in the middle is for. And then you go, okay, well, in 10 seconds, let's say, he's going to be at this point. So we're going to aim at that point. We're going to start firing our rockets. And the rockets get there over the next, 2-3 seconds launch period. So you've been launching them over 2 to 3 seconds. It's taken them 5 seconds to get there. So 7 to 8 seconds total. They've arrived in the airspace 2 or 3 seconds before the V1 does. That airspace is now littered with a bunch of cables. All the V1 has to do is snag one of them. It doesn't even have to rip a wing off, just has to give it a little tug. Over goes the gyro, over goes the V1, down goes the V1. Everybody's happy except for the V1, and it was inanimate, so only its machine spirit was displeased. I can actually see that working. If your target's going to be dumb enough to fly in a dead straight line and physically can't take any evasive maneuvers, it'll work. I mean, other V1 tactics also wouldn't work against manned aircraft. Flying up behind a V1, then nudging yourself alongside, and then rolling your aircraft to use your wingtip to tip a V1 over. Never going to work on a manned aircraft. Works perfectly well against a dumbfire glide bomb, or rocket-powered flying bomb, in any case. So yeah, that's the Tonsil system. Appears to have worked. Has a theoretically plausible method of working. Would love to know more. Maybe I'll have to try and dig some stuff up next time I'm at Q. Andrew Kirshenman asks, how did the US Navy move PT boats to the Pacific theatre? Did they sail them across the Pacific, or were they loaded onto larger ships? They put them on ships, like you can see here. So they'd be stored as deck cargo. Obviously, you could fit a few on a smaller ship, many, many more on much, much larger ships. And they'd be hauled across the Pacific or the Atlantic. Occasionally, they did operate in UK waters as well in this manner. They generally didn't have the range to go across various major parts of the Pacific. And even if they had done, it would be extremely trying, if not fatal, on the crews because, well, it's a big boat, but it's still a boat. So sending it out on, again, even if it did somehow have enough fuel, still sending it out on, 2 to 3 week voyage across the deep Pacific, you're probably at some point going to run into seas that are going to flip you over. And as I said, you've only got a small crew, so trying to run one of those things 24/7 for weeks on end isn't likely to end well in any way, shape or form at all. Now, very occasionally you will come across accounts of PT boats being towed, but that's not from the continental United States to Ulithi or Guadalcanal or the English Channel or anything like that, what would happen is you do the majority of your trip on the back of a freighter, again, as you can see here. But if, let's say, for sake of argument, you dropped a bunch of PT boats off at Espiritu Santo, you might then be towed to the Guadalcanal area to help save on fuel and so forth, because you can find a ship that will tow you there, but it's either far too dangerous for the ship that transported you there on its deck to get that close, or there aren't appropriate unloading facilities as close as you'd want to be. So you were, for shorter distances, essentially, you could tow a PT boat with its crew aboard, but generally speaking, if you want to move a PT boat over a long distance, you're sticking it on the back of a freighter. Dr. D.M. Platt asks, how were ships serviced in Scapa Flow during the first half of the 20th century? Could a ship get better service at Scapa Flow or Ulithi in the middle of 1944, for example? It depends what level of maintenance you require, because Scapa is more safe anchorage than it is proper harbour in the sense of, a naval base. And therefore, there aren't extensive port facilities. So if you need a general, rest, refit, overhaul, just freshening a ship up after a mission, you can do that in Scapa. There'll be repair ships, there'll be a certain amount of stores and so forth shoreside, there'll be a few docks, as in, piers and so forth, that you might be able to come alongside, at least for the smaller ships. But that's pretty much the extent of it. If you've got a big hole in your hull, or you've had a bomb land somewhere on the upper deck and it's blown a big crater in the ship, that's not the kind of thing that can be fixed at Scapa. But the reason they didn't try to enhance Scapa to include those kinds of facilities is because ultimately, a few hours steaming down the coast in Scotland, there were those kinds of facilities in much, much greater abundance. So there wasn't really much point. During World War II, for a brief period, there was actually Admiral Floating Drydock number 12 based in Scapa, but that thing could only lift a particularly large destroyer or half a small cruiser. It wasn't big enough or had anywhere near enough lifting capacity to service cruisers, battleships, aircraft carriers, and so forth. In fact, the only time a full-scale floating dry dock was ever seen at Scapa was actually in the 1920s, when they brought one up for salvaging all the German battleships of the High Seas Fleet, and then it went away again. So if you were in the middle of 1944 and your ship needed heavy servicing, you'd be much better off at Ulithi, because Ulithi had a much more comprehensive ship repair facility, made up obviously mostly of the floating dry dock systems, simply because, well, at Ulithi, that was your stop for, and your only stop for a very, 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 very long way. If you were damaged and you just about managed to get to Ulithi, chances are you probably wouldn't survive the voyage anywhere else that had permanent infrastructure like Pearl Harbor. Whereas, as I said, with Scapa, if you were damaged, to be honest, if you were damaged away from Scapa in the North Sea or in the North Atlantic, you were probably closer to somewhere like Liverpool or Rosyth or Portsmouth or Plymouth or any number of other UK port facilities that had permanent dry docks. And therefore, going back to Scapa, not only does Scapa not have the facilities, but you'd actually be sailing further. I'm making this up as I go asks, in the July 9th, 1745 encounter between HMS Lion and La Elizabeth, Lion reportedly closed within pistol shot before opening fire. On paper, the ships weren't hugely mismatched, but Elizabeth may have been damaged earlier or just wasn't built for speed. Given her job escorting Du Tellier, was Captain Pierre de Howe in a position to make any real tactical choices, or was he effectively stuck holding the line while Du Tellier ran for it? I'm curious as to whether this was a case of a brave rearguard action, bad luck, or just no good options available. And for those of you wondering what the heck on earth we're actually talking about here, this is an action that immediately precedes the 1745 Jacobite uprising and is in large part responsible to a certain degree for how that went. So you've got Prince Charles, the exile, aka Bonnie Prince Charlie, except blah, 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 whatever. Anyway, he's in France, and he manages to persuade the French to help him out trying to raise a rebellion in Scotland. And he sets out on the frigate Dutelier, which you can see here on the right. And along the way, it meets up with a much larger French actual ship of the line, the Elizabeth, which is carrying most of the men, a bunch of heavy artillery, cannon, and enough swords and other armament to outfit almost 15,000 men, or maybe around 10,000 if you double up on some of the weapons. So essentially, the Elizabeth is kind of an IKEA starter army in a box, just add men, which he was hoping to raise in Scotland. The Dutelier is at the upper end of what would be considered an unrated ship, but it is a very small ship. It wouldn't even count as a 6th-rate frigate. The Elizabeth, on the other hand, as I said, is an actual true ship of the line, but as they're heading up the west coast of England, they're intercepted by HMS Lion, which is variously described as either a 58 or a 60 gunner, so for that time period essentially a 3rd rate. The Elizabeth is generally judged to be a slightly larger vessel than the Lion, but slightly less well equipped, presumably because some of the space that it would otherwise have dedicated to armaments has been dedicated to all the, non-shipboard artillery armaments it's carrying for the young Pretender. And the Lion and the Elizabeth get into a bit of a fight. The Elizabeth isn't fast enough to escape, but it has to kind of protect the Dutelier because ultimately the duty is to protect young Prince Charles. And it's pretty clear what would have happened if it didn't, because as you can see depicted in the painting, the Dutelier does actually try to help the Elizabeth in its fight a couple of times, but even the relatively small chase armament, i.e. in this case the stern armament of the Lion and various other guns that are otherwise unengaged, whenever Dutelier shows up, those guns basically manage to drive Dutelier off in short order. So if Lion had been around to just go after Dutelier, the entire expedition would have been over pretty much before it started, because there's no way that Dutelier would have held out very long. And if it had tried, then probably a lot of people on board, including probably Charles, would have been killed by gunfire. Instead, you get from about 5 in the afternoon to about 10 at night a ongoing duel between the bigger Elizabeth and the Lion, which in the end is a little bit of a score draw. The Elizabeth ends up taking more damage. It has more casualties. More of its officers are killed. But it's not that much more badly affected than Lion. Lion is more affected in its rigging than Elizabeth is. And so eventually Elizabeth is able to break off the action, rejoin Dutelier, and the Lion just isn't in a good enough shape to continue a pursuit. And so the Lion heads off home to say, hey, look what we've encountered. And after some evaluation, it's decided that the Elizabeth is too badly damaged to continue, needs to go back to France, and also it's so badly damaged that actually even coming alongside to try and transfer some of the weaponry, the swords and hand weapons and so forth, from the Elizabeth to the Dutelier is actually too risky. And so the Elizabeth sets off home. Charles decides that regardless of this, he wants to press on, because if he has to turn back as well, then he thinks the whole thing's going to be seen as a failure. Well, yes. But as a result, then when he lands in Scotland, he starts the 1745 uprising, but he starts it without all the cannon and the sidearms and, the army equipment that the Elizabeth was carrying with it, which of course sets back the Jacobite cause a little bit, which ultimately leads in part to his defeat. So yeah, the captain of the Elizabeth, Pierre Dehoux, maybe? He didn't really have much of a choice. He couldn't escape Lion even if he wanted to. He had to stand and fight at some point, but specifically because of the presence of Dutelier, he had to fight Lion a lot sooner and essentially try and hold on either for a win or, as it turns out, pretty much a score draw, to prevent the smaller ship from being overwhelmed. Brian Stevens asks, building on my June question about misunderstood battles, what in your mind is the biggest myth or romanticized idea about Age of Sail naval operations that you wish people better understood? I think the one that I see come up quite a bit here and there, and which actually annoys me a lot when I do see it, is related to the quality of the ships and what qualities those ships have in the Age of Sail, particularly around the Napoleonic era, because I'm not entirely sure where this actually ends up coming from originally, but there seems to be a perception, at least amongst some people and in some books, thankfully not any really good academic ones, but that nonetheless, that in the Age of Sail, the British ships are kind of these crude, ugly, not particularly advanced things that just sail around and batter everybody with gunfire, and essentially kind of like the football hooligan of the sea, crude, unsophisticated, wins primarily just through sheer overwhelming violence. And the French ships are these much technologically superior, beautiful things that somehow still lose. I think in some ways potentially annoys me. To be honest, I'm not sure whether I ran into this first or the kind of mythologizing of Bismarck and to a certain extent the High Seas Fleet of World War I as well. But you almost get a similar thing in World War I and World War II, and not just limited to the naval field, but generally this kind of idea of, British ships, they're really not really that good. They're a bit flawed, relatively unsophisticated, whereas their opponents have these beautiful masterwork, greatest ships in the world, absolutely fantastically engineered, and somehow still get the ever-living heck beaten out of them 6 way from Sundays by their apparently dumb opponents. And I think this kind of general gist really annoys me because it's complete and utter nonsense. And usually made by people, told by people who either clearly don't understand anything about what they're talking about, or have done the barest modicum of research and have decided on the basis of essentially some top trumps level statistics that this must be the case. Whereas in actual fact, what you have is everybody building ships that kind of fit their own national paradigm. And there's a little bit of a vicious circle, admittedly, of circumstances dictating that certain traits will become more and more emphasized because the nature of that particular navy's operations mitigates against the downsides of that trait becoming more obvious. Now, that sounds perhaps a bit convoluted, but allow me to explain. On average, and bear in mind this is on average because there are going to be outliers on all sides, but on average, a French ship of the line, and to a certain extent even a lot of their frigates, in the Napoleonic era, will be faster, carry more guns, and in many cases throw per broadside a somewhat greater weight of metal than their average Royal Navy counterpart. This is very easily seen, for example, if you look at third rates, where the typical French third rate will be an 80 gunner or a heavy 74, whereas the average British third rate will just be a regular 74. Now you might think, well, hang on a minute, that just sounds like the French ships are better. Not necessarily. Because yes, the French 36-pounder, and that's 36 French livres, which is a slightly different unit compared to a pound, yeah, those are heavier than British 32-pounders. They're also much more difficult to load, and or load safely, I should say, and therefore their rate of fire, even with equally trained crews, is going to be less. So yes, you get a greater single broadside, but fewer broadsides going down the line, which can add up and obviously then factor in for gunnery crews, and suddenly, the fact that the British can fire multiple 32-pounder rounds for every 36 lever round you can fire, it turns out the British ships actually, per 5 or 10 minutes, throwing a heck of a lot more metal into you than you ever are into them. So that aside, guns aside, the other issue, and this is something that I've mentioned a few times on other dry docks, is that when you're talking about the Napoleonic era, they were beginning to approach the limits of what you could do with wooden shipbuilding using the techniques that they had available to them. And this meant that when you were looking for speed versus maneuverability versus durability, you were making some fairly hefty trade-offs if you wanted to really emphasize one thing over another. So yes, the average French ship would be quite quick. But as a result of that, it would tend to have a relatively long length to beam ratio, which would then mean, which is actually one of the reasons why they could fit 80 guns on a third rate, because there was just more hull to put guns on. But it also meant that those ships tended to work themselves loose much, 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 much faster. For the French Navy, which spent most of the Napoleonic Wars being blockaded by the British and then doing, essentially dash missions, this didn't matter so much, because you'd do a mission, you'd be back in port. If any of your timbers had started to work loose, you could do maintenance, and then you could go out and repeat the whole process. But for the British, their conditions mitigated against ever adopting this as their building style, because they were doing an awful lot of blockade duty, sitting out for months, potentially maybe even years at a time, riding out in the high seas, waiting for somebody to come out and fight. And in those circumstances, a ship that can work itself loose to the point of leaking like a sieve in 3 or 4 months is not a good design, no matter how quick it is, because you'll end up sinking or having to go back into port. So for them, having a slightly shorter, slightly stouter design that doesn't leak and doesn't work itself to pieces and can ride out storms one after another is a much better design. Also, having a shorter length to breadth ratio with the kind of sail plans and everything they had at the time also made them more agile. So a French ship could outrun a British ship in moderate to moderate heavy winds, but if they ended up in a turning fight, in a melee, in an actual battle, chances were that the British ship could outmaneuver the French ship. Also, again, partly in the interest of speed, partly in the interest of costs, French ships, especially frigates, tended to have a reputation for being very, very lightly built, whereas British ships tended to have a bit more of a reputation for being somewhat more heavily built. Now, that, of course, helps with durability against the weather, but also helps with durability in action. Now, as we've mentioned many times before, especially if you're a frigate, your hull's not necessarily going to stop anything but the lightest of cannon shot, but how well the hull as a structure stands up to that cannon shot can be affected quite heavily by how heavily built your hull is. And you see a similar thing to a lesser extent, but still, with things like the American super frigates, in that people are, yes, well, this was a radical new innovation far in advance of obsolete British design. It's like, no, the French, the Spanish, and the British had all, prior to the American 6 frigates, at some point or another built essentially super frigates that were either similar or of somewhat superior performance to the American ships. But they found that for their fleets, which would have dozens if not hundreds of these ships, these very big, very heavily armed vessels were essentially extremely expensive to build, extremely expensive to run, and massively overkill for 99% of the situations they would ever find themselves in. And so outside of a handful of experimental ships, they just didn't build them. It was much easier, much cheaper to build your standard 5th rates and 6th rates en masse to cover the huge amounts of territory that you needed to do. Which is also why when they started encountering the American super frigates in the War of 1812, the British very quickly turned around and went, oh, yep, okay, fine. And, well, okay, yeah, they did some razzies as well, but they also built a bunch of super frigates of their own, like Newcastle and Leander. It wasn't that it was an unknown design to them or an unknown technology. It was simply that it hadn't fitted the Royal Navy's paradigm of frigate operations until the US built a small navy that had some of these big heavy hitters in it, and then suddenly the Royal Navy, okay, right, if we need something like this, we will have something like this. And, well, after that, the idea of a super frigate kind of stuck. And you can kind of see the evidence for this in that, when the US captured a British ship in decent condition, like the Macedonian, they just went, okay, yeah, it's the USS Macedonian now. It works for us. They didn't go, yes, look at this crude and ineffectual piece of orc technology. Clearly it is far beneath us and we don't need it. We're just going to scrap it. Same thing with the French. On the rare occasion that they managed to capture a major British ship, it went into service with the French Navy. That's why there were 2 Swiftships at the Battle of Trafalgar, one on each side. And equally, the Royal Navy, when they captured a French or a Spanish ship, they went, yep, that's sailing under our flag now. Now, of course, for the average British sailor, a big, fast third rate, as opposed to the slightly smaller, more compact third rates they were used to, they were like, oh, yes, well, this has more space. This is nice. This is quick. This is nice. They're not the ones having to foot the bill to repair it every 3 months, so they didn't care so much. But back at home, this kind of thing did matter to the Admiralty. So I think, overall, that would be the single most annoying thing I find floating around Age of Sail opinions that people have. This idea that there's this crude, unassuming, brutish British Navy and everybody else is somehow so much better than them but still being beaten into the ground by them. It's not. It's literally just the case of each navy is building ships that match its operational paradigm, and to a certain degree they are actually interchangeable. And finally for this week, Vokir asks, generally, how many capital ships were in Scapa Flow at one time? Was Royal Oak just unlucky to get caught, or was there a pretty good chance of U-47 finding some major British warships to sink on practically any day that she showed up? Well, if we're talking about early in the war, which is when U-47 shows up, there's a reasonable chance you're going to find something big at any given time. I mean, there's always going to be a battleship hull or 2 in Scapa, simply because of the presence of the Iron Duke and the Centurion, albeit they're not frontline battleships, they're training ships, but they are still battleship hulls. But in terms of the actual capital ships themselves, if you want to look at purely frontline units, it's a bit of a coin toss, but there's a reasonable chance, because we're talking about before Italy has gone properly into the war, so the Mediterranean fleet has been stripped, and most of the Mediterranean fleet's vessels, or capital vessels at the very least, are probably in or around Scapa. Obviously Japan hasn't got involved, so there's going to be battleships out doing convoy protection. There's going to be a few battleships elsewhere that aren't with the home fleet, but a good chunk of the Royal Navy's capital ship assets are going to be based in Scapa. Now, obviously from that, some of them are going to be off for maintenance in various ports and so forth. Some of them are going to be going to and from operational areas, and that's going to reduce the overall numbers, but theoretically that should still leave some that aren't immediately needed and therefore would be in Scapa, as Royal Oak happened to be in this particular instance. But of course, if you have exercises or some kind of operation going on, or some kind of sailing that to counter a potential operation, or all these kinds of things, that could lead to a majority or all of the capital ships being not present on a particular night. So you are still rolling the dice a bit. But even then, there would be other important stuff, even if there weren't capital ships, that you could go after instead. In fact, in many ways, Prien was a little bit unlucky because German recon overflights in the run-up to his operation had actually been interpreted by the British as preparations for a mass air attack, and so many of the ships that Prien probably would have preferred to shoot at had dispersed to other ports briefly, thinking that some kind of major air assault was inbound, which meant that when he showed up, the only big ships around were Royal Oak and Belfast, and of course he sank Royal Oak and escaped, whereas if there hadn't been quite as much German recon activity, he might have actually had better targets. And that brings an end to this video. Thank you very much for listening, everybody. And I hope to see you again in another video at some point in the not too distant future. Bye for now. And that brings us to the end of this week's Drydock. Thank you very much for listening, everyone. And next week is, of course, the Patreon Drydock, so look forward to that, hopefully, at least if you need a good sleep.